The most successful man in the city had everything people spent their entire lives chasing. He had the penthouse overlooking the skyline, the company name printed on skyscrapers, the private jets waiting whenever he wanted to escape, and the kind of wealth that made strangers smile before they even knew his name. But every night, when the lights of the city disappeared behind the glass walls of his apartment, there was one thing he could never buy: someone waiting for him, someone asking how his day was, someone saving him a seat at the dinner table. Because behind the headlines, behind the business magazines, behind the carefully prepared photographs of a confident CEO shaking hands with world leaders, Daniel Whitmore was just a man who had forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. At 42 years old, Daniel had mastered the art of winning. He knew how to negotiate million-dollar deals without blinking. He knew how to walk into a room full of powerful executives and make everyone listen. He knew how to turn failing companies into successful empires. But he had never learned how to answer a simple question: who are you when nobody is watching? The world knew Daniel Whitmore as the brilliant founder of Whitmore Technologies, a company that had changed the way people interacted with artificial intelligence. His inventions were used around the world. His interviews appeared on business channels. His name was spoken with admiration in places he had never visited, called him a genius. People called him unstoppable. People called him lucky. But nobody called him home. On a cold Friday evening, while rain covered the city streets like a gray blanket, Daniel found himself sitting alone inside a small neighborhood diner he had never noticed before. The place was called Maple Corner Diner. Wasn't impressive. There were no expensive decorations, no private rooms, no crystal glasses or carefully trained staff waiting to anticipate every need. The walls were covered with old photographs of families who had eaten there for decades. The wooden tables had tiny scratches from years of use. The ceiling fan made a quiet clicking sound every few seconds. To most people, it looked ordinary. To Daniel, it looked alive. He sat near the window in a dark suit that probably cost more than everything inside the diner combined. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. The waitress had brought it 15 minutes earlier, but he had forgotten it was there. His phone rested beside his hand, constantly lighting up with messages. Investors, executives, employees who needed something from him. He looked at the screen. Another email. Another problem. Another request. He turned the phone face down. For once, he didn't want to be needed. He wanted to be noticed. There was a difference. Outside, rushed through the rain carrying umbrellas, heading toward families, friends, and warm homes. Daniel watched them through the fogged window. A father holding his daughter's hand. An elderly couple sharing one umbrella. Two teenagers laughing as they ran through puddles. Small moments. Normal moments. Moments money could never create. He quietly whispered to himself, "When did I stop having that?" The question surprised him because he already knew the answer. Years ago, his father died. After his mother passed away. After the woman he once loved told him that she was tired of competing with his ambition. After every relationship became a business transaction, Daniel had slowly built walls around himself. At first, the walls protected him. Then one day, he realized they were keeping everyone else out, including happiness. The waitress walked by and noticed his untouched coffee. "Everything okay, sir?" Daniel looked up. He almost gave the usual answer. "I'm fine." Everyone said that. Successful people especially. "I'm fine," was the favorite lie of people who had everything except peace. Something about the small diner made lying feel harder. He looked at the woman and simply said, "Just tired." The waitress gave him a knowing smile. "Long week." Daniel almost laughed. Long week was an understatement. His weeks had become years. Something like that. She nodded and walked away. No questions. No judgment. No attempt to impress him. It was strange, usually changed when they recognized him. They became nervous. They became overly friendly. They suddenly remembered they had a business idea they wanted to share. But here, he was just another lonely customer sitting at a table, and somehow that felt peaceful. The bell above the diner door suddenly rang. A cold breeze entered as someone stepped inside. Daniel barely looked up at first. Then he heard laughter, a child's laughter. Not the polite kind, not the careful kind, the kind that filled a room without asking permission. A little girl wearing a bright yellow raincoat walked inside while holding the hand of a woman who looked exhausted but happy. The woman shook rain from her hair and smiled apologetically at the waitress. "Sorry we're late, Gloria. The bus decided today was the perfect day to take forever." The waitress laughed. "You two always come in eventually." The little girl removed her raincoat and proudly placed a small stuffed rabbit on the chair beside her. Mr. Bunny was patient. He knew we'd make it. Daniel looked away. He didn't know why he was watching them. Maybe because they looked like something he had forgotten existed. Warmth. The woman guided the girl toward a booth near his table. She was not dressed in expensive clothes. Her coat was old but clean. Her shoes had clearly seen better days. There was something about her. A quiet strength. The kind of person who had been through storms but refused to become one. The little girl climbed into the seat and immediately began coloring on a small paper menu. Daniel returned his attention to his coffee, or at least tried. A few minutes later, he felt something, someone staring. He looked up. The little girl was watching him, not fearfully, not suspiciously, curiously. Children had a way of seeing things adults ignored. Daniel gave her a small, polite smile. She didn't smile back. Instead, she tilted her head, like she was solving a mystery. Then she looked at her mother, then back at him. Daniel continued pretending not to notice. A few seconds passed. Then tiny footsteps approached his table. He looked up. The girl stood there holding her drawing. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm. "Excuse me, mister." Daniel looked behind himself. "Me?" She nodded seriously. "Yes." He smiled slightly. "Can I help you?" The little girl studied his face. Then she said something that made him completely freeze. "You look lonely." Daniel had heard thousands of comments about himself. Smart, successful, powerful, difficult, demanding, but never lonely. He didn't know how to respond. The girl continued. "Are you sad?" Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because somehow this 5-year-old child had asked the question nobody else had been brave enough to ask. "Finally," he said quietly, "maybe a little." The girl's eyes softened. She looked back at her mother. Her mother had noticed what was happening and immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said from the booth. "She has a habit of talking to everyone." Daniel smiled. "She's okay." The little girl stepped closer. Then she placed the drawing on his table. It was made with colorful crayons. There were 3 people holding hands. A small girl, a woman, and a man wearing a suit. Above them was a big yellow sun. Daniel looked at it carefully. He noticed the words written with uneven handwriting. "Smile, mister. You can borrow my mom." For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore felt something he couldn't explain. Not sadness, not happiness. Something in between. Something that felt like a door opening after being locked for a very long time. The little girl smiled proudly. "My mom gives the best hugs." Daniel looked at her, then at the drawing, then toward the woman standing nearby, clearly embarrassed but smiling. "I think your daughter is very kind." The woman walked over. "I'm really sorry. I'm Grace." Daniel stood. "Daniel." She looked at the drawing in his hand. "Emily thinks she can fix everyone's problems." The little girl crossed her arms. "I don't fix problems." She pointed at Daniel. "I help lonely people." Grace laughed softly, and somehow Daniel found himself laughing too. A real laugh. Not the controlled smile he gave during interviews. Not the polite expression he used during meetings. A real laugh. The kind that surprised him because he had almost forgotten how it sounded. Grace noticed. "You should do that more often," looked confused.
"Do what? Laugh?"
She smiled. "It looks good on you." For a moment, the world outside disappeared. The rain, the city, the pressure, the expectations. Everything. There was only a small diner table, a child with crayons, and a woman who had no idea. She had just changed the life of one of the most powerful men in the world. Daniel looked at the empty seat across from him. Then he looked at Emily. Then Grace. And before he could overthink it, he heard himself say, "Would you like some company?" Grace hesitated. Emily immediately answered, "Yes." Grace smiled. "Emily usually doesn't let strangers join us." Emily shook her head. "He's not a stranger anymore." Daniel looked at her. "How did I become not a stranger?" She shrugged. "Because I gave you a drawing." It was such a simple answer, but somehow perfect sense. Daniel picked up his coffee. For the first time that evening, it wasn't cold. And for the first time in years, neither was he. Daniel had spent most of his life believing that important moments announced themselves. He thought life, changing events came with flashing signs, dramatic speeches, or some obvious indication that something significant was happening. A major business deal, a historic company launch, a decision that affected thousands of employees. Those were the moments he had trained himself to recognize. Sitting in a small diner with a little girl coloring beside him and her mother, quietly sipping coffee across the table, Daniel began to wonder if the most important moments were actually the ones nobody planned. The ones that arrived unexpectedly, the ones that looked ordinary until years later when you looked back and realized they had changed everything. Emily was explaining why her stuffed rabbit Mr. Bunny needed his own seat. Apparently missed it. Important emotional responsibilities. Daniel listened carefully. Something about the seriousness in her voice made it impossible not to smile. So what exactly are Mr. Bunny's responsibilities? Emily looked shocked that he had to ask. He listens. Daniel nodded. That's important. Yes, she said, because sometimes people just need someone to listen. The words were simple, but they landed harder than Daniel expected, because for years he had been surrounded by people who spoke. Employees gave presentations, investors gave opinions, executives gave advice. Everyone had something to say, but very few people actually listened, noticed the small change in his expression. "You know," she said gently, "she's surprisingly good at understanding people." Daniel glanced at Emily. "I noticed. She thinks everyone has a story." Emily nodded proudly. "Everyone does." Daniel smiled. "Even me." Emily looked at him like the answer was obvious. "Especially you?" Grace laughed quietly. "She has decided you are interesting." "Interesting?" "Yes." Daniel leaned back. "I run one of the largest technology companies in the world, and a 5-year. Old thinks I'm interesting because I'm sad." Emily raised her hand. "Also because you wear a fancy suit." Daniel looked down at himself. "This old thing." Grace smiled. "She means your suit costs more than our apartment." Daniel looked embarrassed. "I didn't realize." "I know." The way she said it surprised him. There was no jealousy, no bitterness, just honesty. That was what fascinated him about Grace. She knew he had money. She knew he lived a completely different life. But she didn't seem impressed by it. She wasn't trying to get closer to his success. She was simply sitting across from a lonely man. And somehow, that felt more valuable than anything he had experienced in years. The three of them stayed at the diner much longer than Daniel expected. Normally, he measured his time in schedules. Every minute had a purpose. Every meeting had an objective. Every conversation had an expected outcome. But that night, there was no agenda, no contract, no negotiation, no reason. And strangely, It was the first time in years that he felt completely comfortable. Grace told him about Emily, how she loved drawing, how she asked endless questions, how she believed every dog secretly understood human language. Daniel laughed. She's probably right. Grace looked surprised. You believe that? I believe I've met executives who understand less than dogs. Grace laughed. A real laugh. Daniel noticed something. He liked making her laugh. The realization caught him off guard. It wasn't about attraction. Not yet. It was something quieter. Something deeper. He liked seeing happiness appear on someone's face because of something he said. That feeling was unfamiliar. In his world, people laughed because they wanted something, because they were nervous, because they wanted approval. This was different. This was genuine. Eventually, the diner began emptying. The old couple near the counter left. The family celebrating a birthday packed their leftovers. The waitress started wiping tables. Daniel looked at the clock and realized almost 3 hours had passed. 3 hours. He couldn't remember the last time 3 hours disappeared without him checking his phone. Grace noticed. We should probably let you go. Daniel looked disappointed before he could hide it. The reaction surprised even him. Emily noticed too. You don't want to leave. Daniel smiled. You are very observant. I know. Grace shook her head. She gets that from me. Emily immediately disagreed. No. Daniel laughed. There it was again. That feeling. Warm. Simple. Real. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets reflected the yellow lights from the buildings. Daniel walked with them toward the entrance. He wasn't sure why he offered. Maybe because he didn't want the evening to end. Maybe because some part of him already knew this was something rare. Grace picked up Emily, who was becoming sleepier with every step. Thank you for dinner. Daniel looked confused. I didn't pay. Exactly. He raised an eyebrow. What? You didn't try to fix anything. Daniel stayed quiet. Grace continued. Most wealthy people I meet think every problem has a price tag. They try to solve everything by giving something. Daniel looked away, 'cause she wasn't wrong. That was exactly how he lived. If someone had a problem, he offered money. If something broke, he replaced it. If something failed, he bought something better. But nobody had ever told him that some things weren't asking to be solved. Some things were asking to be shared. Grace adjusted Emily in her arms. Tonight you just sat with us. Daniel nodded slowly. That was enough. Sometimes that's everything. The words stayed with him. Before they left, Emily reached into her little backpack, another piece of paper. For you. Daniel accepted it. Another drawing. Yes. He unfolded it. This one showed 3 people again. But this time, there was a small house. And above it, happy people live here. Daniel stared at it. Something tightened in his chest. Thank you, Emily. She smiled. Don't forget. Forget what? She pointed at the drawing. You're supposed to smile. Daniel laughed softly. I'll try. Emily looked serious. Not try. She corrected him. Do. Grace smiled. She doesn't negotiate. I noticed. Daniel watched as they walked away, a mother carrying her child. A little girl waving goodbye. 2 people who had entered his life only hours ago. And yet somehow, the street felt emptier after they disappeared. He returned to his car. His driver immediately stepped out. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel nodded. But before getting inside, he looked back at the diner. The small place. The ordinary place. The place where nobody cared about his company. Nobody cared about his money. Nobody cared about his reputation. They cared that he was lonely. And somehow, that mattered more. When he arrived at his penthouse later that night, everything looked exactly the same. The expensive furniture, the perfect lighting, the silent rooms, the view that millions of people would dream about. But Daniel saw it differently now. For the first time, he noticed what was missing. The apartment was beautiful, but it wasn't warm. He walked to the kitchen. opened the refrigerator. Inside were expensive bottles, prepared meals, and ingredients he never used. Everything was organized. Everything was perfect. Everything felt empty. He reached into his coat pocket. The drawing was still there. He placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. He stood there staring at it. A 5-year-old girl had given him a piece of paper worth almost nothing, and somehow felt more valuable than everything else he owned. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his office earlier than usual. His employees immediately noticed something different. Not because he said anything, because Daniel Whitmore was usually predictable, cold, efficient. But that morning, he smiled at the receptionist. The receptionist nearly dropped her coffee. Good morning, Sarah," she stared. He knew her name. Usually, he walked past without noticing. Have a good day. Daniel continued walking. Sarah watched him disappear. Something had changed. Inside the elevator, Daniel looked at his reflection. Same suit, same face, same man. But something felt different. The board meeting began at 9. Executives discussed quarterly numbers. Investors discussed expansion. Everyone talked about growth. But Daniel found himself distracted, not by problems, by a thought. Friday. He looked at his calendar. 7 days away. And for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business. He wanted to return to that diner. He wanted to see Emily's drawings. He wanted to hear Grace laugh, and he wanted to understand why a simple evening with strangers had made his own home feel less like a prison. He didn't know it yet. That small diner had not just given him a pleasant memory. It had given him something much more dangerous. Hope. Hope was something Daniel had spent years avoiding. Because once you found something worth wanting, you also found something worth losing. Strange thing about hope was that it could make a person feel both stronger and more vulnerable at the same time. Daniel Whitmore had spent decades building a life where nothing could surprise him. He planned everything. His mornings started at the same time. His meetings followed strict schedules. His decisions were calculated through numbers, research, probability. He believed control was the secret to success. And maybe it was. Control had helped him build a company from a small office into a global empire. Control had helped him survive moments when other people would have given up. Control had protected him from disappointment. But now, because of a little girl with crayons and a mother who smiled at strangers, Daniel was beginning to realize something. The same walls that protected him had also trapped him. For the entire week, Daniel found himself thinking about Friday, not in the way he thought about business deadlines, not with pressure, not with anxiety, with anticipation. It was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. On Wednesday afternoon, his assistant noticed him looking at his calendar. Is there something important scheduled for Friday evening, Mr. Whitmore? Daniel looked up. No. His assistant waited, because everyone who worked with Daniel knew there was always something. No meetings. No. No investor calls. No. The assistant looked confused. Daniel almost smiled. I have dinner plans. The assistant checked the calendar again. There isn't anything listed. Daniel paused. Then he said quietly, It's not a business dinner. That sentence alone would have shocked everyone in his company. Daniel Whitmore did not have non-business dinners. His entire adult life had been built around one idea: never waste time. What he was slowly learning was that time spent with people who mattered was never wasted. Friday finally arrived, and for the first time in years, Daniel left his office before sunset. His employees noticed. Some looked at each other in confusion. Others assumed there was some secret meeting. Nobody imagined the truth. Their CEO, the man who had rejected countless invitations from celebrities, politicians, and billionaires, was rushing across the city because a 5-year-old girl might be waiting for him at a diner. When Daniel entered Maple Corner Diner, the bell above the door rang. The sound was ordinary, but to him it felt like the beginning of something. He looked around. For a brief moment, fear appeared. What if they weren't there? What if last week was just a random moment? What if he had imagined the connection? Then he saw her. Emily was sitting in the same booth. The second she noticed him, her face lit up. She jumped from her seat. Grace turned around, and when she saw him, she smiled. Not surprised, not overly excited, just genuinely happy, and somehow that meant more. "You came back," Grace said. Daniel smiled. "I said I would." Emily nodded proudly. "I knew you would." Daniel walked toward the table. "How?" She shrugged. "Because you looked like someone who needed friends." Daniel laughed. Children had a way of saying things adults spent years avoiding. He sat down with them, and something unexpected happened. He immediately felt comfortable. No pressure, no performance. No need to pretend. He wasn't the CEO of Whitmore Technologies. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a public figure. He was just Daniel, a man sitting at a diner table with two people who made him feel seen. Over the next few weeks, Friday evenings became their tradition. Nobody officially announced it. Nobody made a promise. It simply happened. Every Friday at 6 o'clock, Daniel walked through the diner doors. And every Friday, Emily acted as if she had been waiting all day. Sometimes she brought drawings. Sometimes she brought questions. Sometimes she brought strange facts she learned from school. "Did you know elephants can recognize themselves in mirrors?" Daniel nodded. "That's impressive." "Yes." She looked serious. "Do you think rich people can recognize themselves?" Daniel almost laughed. "Why would you ask that?" "Because grown-ups forget who they are." The table became quiet for a moment. Grace looked at her daughter. "Where do you get these ideas?" Emily shrugged. "I just think." Daniel looked at Grace. "She's remarkable." Grace smiled. "She has always been different." There was pride in her voice, but there was also exhaustion. Daniel noticed things. Small things. The way Grace counted every dollar before ordering. The way she gave Emily the last piece of dessert, even when she wanted it herself. The way she smiled even when she looked tired. He knew success. He knew ambition. He knew people who fought for power. Grace fought for something else. A good life. A safe home. A happy childhood for her daughter. And somehow, that impressed him more than any business achievement. One evening, after Emily fell asleep at the table waiting for her hot chocolate to cool, Daniel and Grace sat quietly. The diner was calmer than usual. Rain tapped gently against the windows. "You don't talk much about yourself," Daniel said. Grace looked surprised. "I do. You talk about Emily." She smiled. "She's the most important part." "I know." Grace looked down. "What about you?" Daniel leaned back. "What about me?" "What is the most important part of your life?" The question was simple, but Daniel didn't have an answer. For years, he had been able to answer questions about his company instantly. Revenue, growth, goals. This was harder. "I don't know anymore." Grace looked at him. "That's honest." "It scares me." "Why?" "Because I used to know exactly what I wanted." "And now?" Daniel looked toward Emily. "Now I'm not sure I ever wanted the right things." Grace didn't respond immediately. She didn't rush to give advice. That was another thing he liked about her. She didn't try to repair him. She simply listened. "My father used to say something," Grace finally said. Daniel looked at her. "He said a house isn't a home because of the walls." She smiled softly. "It's a home because of who is inside." Daniel looked around the diner. At the families, the couples, the people laughing. Then he looked back at Grace. "Your father was wise." "He was. He's still around." Grace's smile faded slightly. Daniel understood. She nodded. "Thank you." There was a quiet moment. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. "I lost my parents too." Grace looked surprised. "You don't talk about them." "No!"
Why?
Daniel looked at the rain outside. Because when you lose the last people who knew you before you became successful, feels like losing a piece of yourself. Grace's expression softened. That's a lonely feeling. It is. For the first time, Daniel realized something. He and Grace were not as different as they seemed. One had money, one did not. One lived in a penthouse, one lived in a small apartment. One built companies, one raised a child. But underneath everything, they were two people who had experienced loss. Two people who knew what it felt like to continue living while carrying invisible pain, and maybe that was why they understood each other. Not because they were similar, because they were both human. Later that night, Daniel walked them home. Emily held his hand. She did it naturally, without asking, without hesitation, and Daniel allowed it. Years ago, he would have considered that impossible. A child trusting him, a family welcoming him, a woman seeing him as something more than his achievements. When they reached their apartment building, Emily stopped. Daniel smiled. Of course. She pointed at him. Don't forget. Forget what? Smile. Daniel laughed. Grace looked at him. Thank you. For what? For making her happy. Daniel shook his head. She makes me happy. Grace smiled. And that sentence stayed with her, because she could hear the truth in his voice. Daniel Whitmore wasn't pretending. Something inside him had changed. And neither of them knew it yet. But the small friendship created inside a neighborhood diner was slowly becoming something neither of them had expected. Something that would challenge everything Daniel believed about success. Something that would force him to choose between the life he built for Saul and the life he actually wanted. People around Daniel Whitmore began noticing the change before Daniel himself fully understood it. At first, it was small, almost invisible, a greeting to employees he used to walk past, a question about someone's family, a moment where he stayed after a meeting instead of immediately leaving. For years, people at Whitmore Technologies had known their CEO as a brilliant man with an impossible work ethic. They respected him, admired him, some even feared him, but they never felt close to him. Daniel had always been a person who entered a room and changed the atmosphere. Not because he demanded attention, because he carried the weight of someone who had trained himself never to need anyone. His employees often joked that Daniel Whitmore probably slept with a laptop beside him. They weren't entirely wrong. But recently, something was different. He still worked hard. He still expected excellence. He still made difficult decisions. There was warmth behind his eyes now, a softness that hadn't existed before. His assistant, Claire, noticed it more than anyone. She had worked with Daniel for almost 8 years. She knew his habits better than most people. She knew when he was stressed. She knew when he was frustrated. She knew when he was pretending everything was fine. And she knew this was different. One morning, she walked into his office carrying his schedule. Your 10 o'clock meeting has been moved to 11. Daniel looked up. Thank you. Claire paused. Usually, that was all she would receive. A simple acknowledgement. But then Daniel added, How is your daughter doing? Claire froze. My daughter. Daniel nodded. You mentioned last month she was applying to college. Claire stared at him. She's doing well. I'm glad. A small smile appeared on her face. Thank you for asking. After she left, Daniel sat quietly. It was such a small conversation, almost meaningless. But to him, it felt important. Because he was beginning to understand something. A person's life wasn't changed only by huge moments. Sometimes it was changed by small acts of attention, something Emily had understood naturally, something adults often forgot. That people wanted to be seen. Not used. Not impressed. Seen. Friday, Daniel arrived at the diner carrying something unusual. A small paper bag. Emily noticed immediately. What is that? Daniel smiled. Hello to you too. She narrowed her eyes. You brought something. Maybe. Grace laughed. She interrogates everyone. Daniel handed the bag over. Inside were 3 children's books. Emily gasped. You bought books? I was told you like stories. I love stories. She pulled one out, then looked at him suspiciously. Did you read these? Daniel hesitated. Some. Grace smiled. Some. I reviewed them carefully. Emily looked at her mother. That means he didn't read them. Daniel laughed. I read enough. Emily hugged the book. Thank you. And that simple hug affected him more than any award he had ever received, because it wasn't admiration. It wasn't respect. It was affection. Something he couldn't earn through success, something he could only receive. Over dinner, Emily told him about her week. She talked about school, her drawings, a classmate who had lost a tooth, a teacher who wore funny socks. Daniel listened to every word, not because he was pretending, because he actually cared. Grace watched him quietly. She noticed something. The man who once looked uncomfortable around children now sat there laughing with one. The man who once avoided emotional conversations was now sharing pieces of himself. The man who had everything, but nobody had finally started letting people in. After dinner, Emily became focused on coloring. Grace and Daniel sat quietly. You really like her, Grace said. Daniel smiled. Is it that obvious? Very. He looked at Emily. She's special. She is. There was something in Grace's voice, a mixture of love and worry. Daniel noticed. Something wrong. Grace hesitated. No, but Daniel waited. It was something new for him, waiting. Giving someone space. Finally, she sighed. I just don't want her to get attached to someone who might disappear. The words hit him harder than she intended. Daniel looked down. I wouldn't do that. I know you don't mean to. Grace looked at him. But life changes. Daniel was quiet. Because she was right. He had seen it happen. People leaving. People changing. People choosing something else. He had built his own walls because he believed distance prevented pain. But now he was realizing distance created another kind of pain, of never having anything to lose. I don't want to disappear, he said softly. Grace studied his face. I believe you. And somehow, that meant everything. Because trust from Grace wasn't given easily. She wasn't impressed by his money. She wasn't interested in his status. She trusted actions, not words. And Daniel wanted to prove himself. Not because he needed approval, because he finally cared. The weeks continued. And slowly Daniel became part of their routine. Not officially, not yet, but naturally, he learned Emily's favorite ice cream flavor. Strawberry. He learned she hated thunderstorms, but loved watching lightning from safe windows. He learned Grace drank coffee only when she was tired, which meant she drank coffee almost every day. He learned the little things. And those little things became everything. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel invited them to his home. At first, Grace hesitated.
Are you sure?
Daniel smiled. Why wouldn't I be? She looked around the massive apartment. It feels like a museum. Daniel laughed. That's fair. When they arrived, Emily walked through the front door and stopped. She looked around. Wow. Daniel smiled. Good wow or bad wow? She thought carefully. Wow. Then she whispered, but it needs help. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Help. She nodded. It looks lonely. The words were innocent, but they were accurate. The apartment was beautiful, expensive, perfect, and completely empty. Emily walked toward the windows. You can see everything from here. Daniel stood beside her. Almost everything. Can you see your friends? The question surprised him. No. Then not everything? Daniel looked at her, and once again, a child had said something that an adult would have spent years trying to explain. Grace watched from across the room. She saw Daniel's expression change, like a door had opened. Later that afternoon, something happened that Daniel never expected. Emily asked if she could draw on his refrigerator. Daniel almost said no. That instinct appeared automatically. His home had always been organized. controlled, perfect. But then he remembered something. Perfect places were not always happy places, so he smiled. Go ahead. Emily celebrated like she had won an award. Within minutes, his spotless refrigerator had colorful drawings attached with magnets. A sun, a rabbit, a family. Grace looked nervous. I'm sorry. We can take them down. Daniel shook his head. No. She looked surprised. Really? He touched one of the drawings. Leave them. That evening after they left, Daniel stood alone in his kitchen. The apartment was still quiet, but it didn't feel as empty. Drawings changed something. Not the room. Him. For the first time, his home showed evidence that another person existed there. Evidence that life had happened. And he realized something painful. He had spent years protecting his possessions, but he had forgotten to create memories. That night, Daniel opened an old drawer. Inside were photographs, his parents, old friends, a younger version of himself who still believed happiness would come after success. He looked at those pictures for a long time. He placed Emily's drawing beside them. A picture of 3 people holding hands. A picture made by a child, that somehow represented the future more than the past. And Daniel knew something. He was no longer waiting for Friday because he needed a distraction. He was waiting because Friday had become the best part of his week. But happiness had a way of testing people. And just when Daniel finally started believing he had found something real, life was preparing to remind him that everything precious could also be fragile. The hardest thing about finding happiness was realizing how much you had to lose. For years, Daniel Whitmore had lived without fear because there was nothing he truly allowed himself to hold on to. His company could rise or fall. His investments could succeed or fail. His reputation could change overnight. Those things mattered, but they were replaceable. Money could rebuild. Businesses could recover. Numbers could be corrected. But people were different. People were not assets. They were not problems to solve. They were not things you could replace when something went wrong. And that realization terrified him, because for the first time in years, Daniel had something he couldn't imagine losing. Not his company. Not his wealth. Them. Grace. Emily. The small moments that had slowly become the most important parts of his life. The Friday dinners. The drawings on his refrigerator. The sound of Emily laughing inside his once silent apartment. The simple feeling of walking through the diner doors and knowing someone was happy he arrived. It was everything he never knew he needed, and because it mattered so much, a small voice inside him began asking a dangerous question. What if it disappeared? Daniel tried to ignore that voice. He had always believed fear was something successful people controlled. But this fear was different. It wasn't about failure. It wasn't about losing money. It was about losing connection. One evening, after dinner at the diner, Daniel walked Grace and Emily home. The city was quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining under the streetlights. Emily walked between them, holding both their hands. Daniel looked down at her small fingers wrapped around his. A strange emotion filled his chest, feeling that was almost painful because it was so unfamiliar. Belonging. At the apartment entrance, Emily stopped. Wait, Daniel looked at her. What happened? She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. For you. Daniel smiled. Another drawing. She nodded. But this one is important. He opened it carefully. This time it wasn't a picture of 3 people. It was a picture of a house. A big house with flowers outside. 3 people stood in front. A man. A little girl. Above them was a sentence written in uneven letters. Home is where people wait for you. Daniel stared at the words, watched his face. Do you like it? He swallowed.
I love it.
She smiled. Good. Then she looked serious, as everyone needs a home. Daniel looked at Grace. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because they both understood what Emily meant. A home wasn't a building. It wasn't an address. It was a feeling. Grace gently touched her daughter's shoulder. "Time to go inside, sweetheart." Emily waved. "See you Friday, Mr. Daniel." Daniel smiled. "See you Friday." But as he walked away, he realized something. He didn't want to only see them on Fridays anymore. The thought surprised him. For months, he had been grateful for the small place they had created in his life. But now, he wanted more. Not because he wanted to take anything away from Grace. Not because he wanted to rush something that was fragile, because he wanted to be there, for the ordinary moments. The school mornings, the difficult days, the random conversations, the moments that didn't happen at a diner table. He wanted to become someone they could count on. But Daniel also knew something. Grace had built her life carefully. She had protected Emily. She had learned how to survive without depending on anyone, and he respected that. The last thing he wanted was to enter their lives like a powerful businessman, trying to fix everything. Grace didn't need saving. She needed someone willing to stand beside her, not in front, not above, beside. The next Monday morning, Daniel arrived at work with a different energy. His schedule was still packed. His responsibilities were still enormous. Something had changed in the way he handled everything. During a leadership meeting, one of his executives presented a proposal. Normally, Daniel would have immediately focused on numbers, efficiency, profit, growth. But this time, before making a decision, he asked, "How will this affect the employees?" The room became quiet. One executive looked surprised. Another checked his notes, because that question was unusual coming from Daniel. Not because he didn't care, but because he rarely allowed himself to think beyond results. After the meeting, Claire followed him into his office. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel looked up. "Of course." She smiled slightly. "You seem happier." Daniel paused. Nobody had said that to him before. Not in years.
Do I? Yes.
Claire sat down. "I've worked with you for a long time, Mr. Whitmore. I've seen you celebrate billion-dollar deals without smiling." Daniel laughed softly. "That's probably true. But lately." She looked thoughtful. "You seem like you're actually living." The words stayed with him. Actually living. 'Cause maybe that was exactly what had been missing. He had existed. He had achieved. He had succeeded. But living, that was different. That afternoon, Daniel made a decision. He left work early. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. He drove to a small bookstore near Grace's apartment. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because Emily loved stories. Maybe because he wanted to understand her world. Maybe because he wanted to become part of it. Inside the bookstore, he found a children's section. He stood there longer than expected. A billionaire CEO surrounded by picture books, a sight nobody in his company would believe. An employee approached him, looking for something specific. Daniel smiled. "Actually, yes." "What kind of book?" Daniel thought. Then he answered, "Something that teaches a child that she matters." The employee smiled. "I think we have a few." Later that evening, Daniel arrived at Grace's apartment carrying a small bag, opened the door and looked surprised. "Daniel." "I..." She looked at the bag. "What is that?" "A book." She smiled. "You came all the way here to bring Emily a book." Daniel shrugged. "Is that strange?" "No," but her smile suggested she found it unexpectedly sweet. Emily appeared from behind the hallway.
Mr. Daniel.
She ran toward him, immediately knelt down. "How was your day?" She began explaining everything at once. A drawing, a story, a disagreement with a classmate about whether cats could become astronauts. Daniel listened, completely. Later, Grace watched him read the book aloud. His voice was not perfect. He changed character voices badly. Emily laughed at him. Daniel didn't care. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply there. After Emily fell asleep, sat across from him.
"You know she really likes you."
Daniel smiled. "I like her too." Grace looked down. That's what worries me. The smile faded from his face. Why? She took a breath. Because she doesn't have many people. Daniel understood. You're afraid she'll get hurt. Yes. The honesty in her voice was painful. Grace continued. Emily's father left when she was very young. He promised he would always be there. She looked toward the bedroom. He wasn't. Daniel stayed silent. I don't want her to learn that people leave. The words hit him deeply. Because suddenly he understood. Grace wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting her daughter, and Daniel respected her even more. I won't make promises I can't keep, he said. Grace looked at him. Then what can you promise? Daniel thought carefully. He answered. That while I'm here, I'll be here completely. Grace didn't respond immediately. Something changed in her expression. Because that was not a rich man's promise, not a CEO's promise. It was a man's promise, a person who understood that love wasn't proven by grand gestures. It was proven by consistency, by showing up, by staying. And for Daniel Whitmore, staying was something he was still learning how to do. Neither of them knew that within days, Daniel's carefully balanced world would be shaken. A business crisis was coming, one that would test his company, his priorities, and the new life he had started building. 'Cause sometimes life asks the hardest questions, right after giving you something worth protecting. Daniel Whitmore had faced difficult moments before. He had faced competitors who tried to destroy his company. He had faced investors who doubted him. He had faced headlines predicting the collapse of everything he built. But those battles were always easier because they followed rules. Business was logical. There were numbers, strategies, solutions. People could be convinced. Markets could recover. Mistakes could be corrected. But life was different. Did not care how intelligent someone was. It did not care how much money they had. It did not care how many problems they had solved before. And Daniel was about to learn that the things that mattered most could never be controlled the same way a company could. The problem started on a Tuesday morning. Daniel was sitting in his office reviewing reports when Claire entered quickly. He immediately noticed something was wrong. She rarely rushed. Mr. Whitmore. Daniel looked up. What happened? She placed a folder on his desk. There is an issue with the international expansion project. Daniel opened the folder. The information was concerning. One of their major investors had suddenly withdrawn support. Petitor had released a similar technology. The market reaction was unstable. The board wanted answers. 6 months earlier, Daniel would have reacted immediately. He would have cancelled everything, called every executive, taken control of every detail. But now, something unexpected happened. His first thought wasn't about the company. It wasn't about the investors. It wasn't even about himself. It was about Friday. Would he still make it? The thought shocked him. Because before Grace and Emily entered his life, missing dinner would not have bothered him. Work always came first. Everything else waited. But now, he understood that some moments did not come back. A business meeting could be rescheduled. A presentation could happen tomorrow. A child waiting at a diner table. That mattered. Claire noticed his silence. Are you okay? Daniel looked up. Yes. Then he corrected himself. No. Claire looked surprised. Daniel rarely admitted that. I have a lot to handle. She nodded. I understand. Daniel looked at the folder, then out the window. The city stretched below him. The same city that once represented success. Now for the first time, it represented something else. A place where 2 people he cared about were living their lives. People who had no idea how much they had changed him. That afternoon, Daniel spent hours in meetings. The board demanded answers. Executives suggested cutting costs. Some recommended canceling projects. Others suggested aggressive moves to protect the company's image. Daniel listened. But something inside him was different. Years ago, he would have made decisions based only on winning. Now he asked different questions. How many employees will this affect? What happens to the people who trusted us? Are we solving the problem or just protecting ourselves? Some executives looked uncomfortable. They were used to the old Daniel, the one who cared about results above everything. This new version confused them. But Daniel understood something. A company was not just buildings and numbers. It was people who mattered. The crisis lasted all week. Long meetings, late nights, constant pressure. But every evening, Daniel found himself looking at the time. Friday was approaching, and for the first time in years, he faced a conflict between two worlds, the world he built and the world he discovered. On Friday afternoon, the situation became worse. A major news outlet released a story questioning Whitmore Technology's future. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. Timing could not have been worse. Daniel looked at the message. Emergency board meeting, 6:00 p.m. Exactly when he was supposed to be at Maple Corner Diner. He stared at the screen. Old Daniel would have accepted immediately. The company came first. But now he hesitated. Not because the meeting wasn't important. Because someone else was important too. Claire noticed. You're thinking about skipping it. Daniel looked at her. I have commitments. Business commitments. He was quiet. Not business. Daniel looked away. Claire smiled slightly. I don't think I've ever seen you struggle with a decision like this. He sighed. Neither have I. She looked at him carefully. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I first started working for you, I thought you were the strongest person I'd ever met. Daniel smiled faintly. And now? Now I think strength isn't just carrying everything alone. Her words reminded him of Grace. You don't have to carry everything alone. Daniel looked at the clock. 5:15. The meeting was in 45 minutes. The diner was 20 minutes away. He could still make it. But if he left, the board would know. His reputation could suffer. The company could look unstable. The old fear returned. What if choosing people meant losing everything else? He remembered something Emily had said. Everyone needs a home. And suddenly, Daniel understood. A home was not something you found after becoming successful. It was something you protected while you were successful. He stood. Mr. Whitmore.
I'm going to the diner.
She blinked. The diner? Daniel nodded. Yes, the board meeting. It can wait 30 minutes. Claire smiled, because she finally understood. This was not Daniel choosing a diner over his company. This was Daniel choosing to become the person he wanted to be. He arrived at Maple Corner Diner at 6:08, 8 minutes late. A few months earlier, 8 minutes would have bothered him. Now, terrified him for a different reason. What if they thought he wasn't coming? He opened the door. The bell rang. And immediately, he saw Emily looking toward the entrance. Her face changed when she saw him.
You came.
Daniel smiled. I said I would. She ran toward him. Grace stood behind her, smiling. But Daniel noticed something. A small look of relief. She had been worried too. I'm sorry I'm late. Grace shook her head. You made it. Those 3 words meant more than she knew. You made it. Not, you succeeded. You won. You impressed everyone. Just you were here. They sat together. But Daniel was quieter than usual. Grace noticed. Something happened. Daniel smiled. How do you know? Because you have the same expression Emily has when she breaks something and tries to hide it. Emily looked offended. I don't do that. Grace raised an eyebrow. Emily looked down. Sometimes. Daniel laughed. Then he told them about the company problems, not all the details. Grace listened. Emily listened too. When he finished, Emily looked confused. Are you sad because your work is sick? Daniel smiled. Something like that. She thought for a moment. Can you fix it? I don't know. Emily nodded. That's okay. Why? Because you can't fix everything. The sentence was simple. But it hit him. Because for most of his life, Daniel believed the opposite. He believed every problem had a solution. Every failure had a strategy. Every pain could be avoided. Maybe some things were not meant to be fixed. Maybe they were meant to be faced. Grace smiled softly. She's right. Daniel looked at them. A mother and daughter sitting across from him. Two people who had no idea they were teaching him lessons no business school could ever teach. That evening, Daniel left the diner feeling lighter. The company problem was still there. The pressure was still there. Nothing had magically disappeared. But something had changed. He no longer felt like he was fighting alone, and that made all the difference. However, the next morning, Daniel received a call that would challenge everything. A person from his past had returned. Someone who knew the man he used to be. Someone who believed Daniel's new life was a weakness. And they were determined to remind him that powerful men were not supposed to need anyone. The person from Daniel's past arrived at his office before noon. Her name was Victoria Lang. For years, Victoria had been one of the few people who could challenge Daniel without hesitation. She was brilliant, confident, and extremely successful in her own right. They had worked together during the early days of Whitmore Technologies. Before the skyscraper, for the billions. Before Daniel became the man everyone recognized. Back then, she knew him differently. She knew the man who stayed late in a tiny office, eating cold takeout, while trying to make his dream real. She knew the man who believed success was the only thing standing between him and happiness. And that was exactly why she was dangerous. Because she remembered the version of Daniel he was trying to leave behind. She entered his office without waiting. "You've changed." Daniel looked up from his desk. "Hello to you too, Victoria." She ignored the greeting. "I've been watching what is happening." Daniel leaned back. "What exactly are you referring to?" "The company." He said nothing. "The decisions you're making." Victoria walked closer. "You used to be focused." Daniel frowned. "I am still focused." "No." She shook her head. "You are distracted." Daniel looked away, because he knew what she meant. Victoria continued. "You built this company because you refuse to let anything get in your way." She placed a folder on his desk. "And now you're letting emotions influence your decisions." Daniel looked at the folder, but didn't open it. "People are not distractions." Victoria smiled slightly. "There it is." "What?" "The reason I'm worried." Daniel looked at her. "You're worried?" "Yes." She lowered her voice. "Because I've seen powerful people lose everything because they started caring too much." Daniel studied her expression. There was no cruelty there, only certainty. Victoria genuinely believed she was protecting him. She didn't understand. Daniel was not losing himself. He was finally finding himself. "You think caring makes me weak. I think caring gives people power over you." Daniel stood. "Maybe that's the point." Victoria looked surprised. "What?" "Maybe spending my entire life making sure nobody could hurt me wasn't strength." Silence filled the office. Because the old Daniel would never have said that. The old Daniel would have dismissed the conversation. He would have returned to work. He would have hidden behind success. But that man was changing. Victoria shook her head. "I don't recognize you anymore." Daniel smiled softly. "For the first time, I think I recognize myself." Victoria left without another word. Her warning stayed with him. Not because he believed her. Because a small part of him was afraid she might be right. That night, Daniel sat in his apartment surrounded by the drawings Emily had made. The refrigerator, the kitchen counter, the bookshelf. His home no longer looked like a showroom. It looked lived in, and strangely, that made him emotional. Because he realized something. The old Daniel would have looked around and seen imperfections. Now he saw memories. The tiny marks of a life being built. The next Friday, Daniel arrived at the diner early. Emily noticed immediately. "You came before me." Daniel smiled. Impossible? She nodded seriously, very suspicious. Grace laughed. The evening passed normally. They ate. They talked. They laughed, and Daniel realized something beautiful. The best moments of life were often the ones that seemed unimportant while they were happening. A conversation, a shared meal, a child's drawing, nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just love appearing in ordinary places. Later that night, while walking Grace and Emily home, Daniel finally said something he had been carrying for weeks. "I want you to know something." Grace looked at him. "What?" "I don't know what the future looks like." She listened. "I know I don't want to go back to the way things were before I met you." Grace was quiet. Daniel continued. "I spent years thinking happiness was something I would find after achieving everything." He smiled sadly. "I think I had it backwards." Grace looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I think happiness is what gives everything else meaning." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace smiled. "You really have changed." Daniel laughed softly. "I know. And are you okay with that?" He looked toward the apartment, where Emily was waiting near the entrance. Then back at Grace. "More than okay." Months later, people at Whitmore Technologies noticed something else. The company recovered. The crisis passed. Investors returned. The competitors' advantage disappeared. But the biggest change was not in the numbers. It was in Daniel. He was still ambitious, still brilliant, still driven. But he was no longer empty. He left work sometimes before midnight. He took weekends. He attended school events. He learned that being successful didn't mean sacrificing every other part of life. One afternoon, Daniel sat in the audience of Emily's school play. He watched her perform with complete confidence. She looked toward him during the performance. When she saw him smiling, she smiled back, and Daniel realized something. Years ago, thousands of people had applauded him, but that small smile from one child meant more than all of it. After the play, Emily ran toward him. "Did you see me?" Daniel smiled. "I saw everything. I was the best one." Grace walked over. "She has a little confidence," Emily corrected her. "A lot." They all laughed. Years later, when people asked Daniel Whitmore what his greatest achievement was, they expected him to mention his company, his inventions, his success, his fortune. But Daniel always surprised them. He would smile and say, "My greatest achievement was learning that I didn't have to earn love." People never understood what he meant, not completely, because they had never sat alone in a diner with a cold cup of coffee. They had never known what it felt like to have everything and still feel like nothing. They had never experienced the moment when someone small and innocent looked at them and saw the truth they were hiding. Daniel remembered. He remembered the rainy evening, the yellow raincoat, the crayon drawing, the words that changed his life. "Smile, mister. You can borrow my mom." What started as a child's kindness became something much bigger. It became a reminder that sometimes the people who save us are not the ones with power. Sometimes they are the ones who simply notice we are hurting. Sometimes they are the ones brave enough to walk across a room and ask, "Are you okay?" And sometimes, if we are lucky enough, they become home. The little diner on Maple Street eventually framed Emily's first drawing and placed it near the entrance. Customers asked about it all the time. The staff would smile and tell them the story of the lonely CEO, the single mother, the little girl who believed nobody should sit alone. And if you visited on a Friday evening, you might still see them, a family sitting together, laughing, sharing food, making memories, not because they had a perfect life, because they had something better. They had each other, and Daniel Whitmore, the man who once owned everything but belonged nowhere, finally understood the truth. A person does not become rich when they have more things, become rich when they have someone to share life with. And sometimes, the greatest fortune in the world begins with a simple smile.